Her brothers-in-law burned her letters and left her chained in the corn crib. The chain was a log chain, the kind you'd use to pull a stuck wagon out of a creek bed, heavy enough that a grown man would feel it after an hour. She'd been wearing it for 3 days. I know that because Deke Ferris told me, and Deke Ferris was the kind of man who told you a thing like that the way another man might describe the weather. Matter of fact, like it was just a detail in a longer story about himself. He was leaning on the bar at Colton's when he said it. He had a drink in his hand and a little smile on his face, and he said Nora Vass had gotten ideas above herself since Clement died, and his brother Royce had put her right. I'd known Clement Vass. We weren't close, but I knew him well enough. He was a decent man who drank too much and worked too little and married a woman who was worth 10 of him. When he died of a fever the winter before last, I figured Nora would sell out and go back to her people in Kansas. Instead, she stayed, because the land was hers by marriage and she intended to work it. Clement's brothers had other intentions. Deke finished his drink and set the glass down easy and said Nora had been writing letters to a lawyer in Austin, trying to file a claim on the deed to the Vass quarter section. Royce had intercepted the letters, had a friend at the postal station, apparently, and burned them. When Nora found out and said she'd ride to Austin herself, Royce chained her in the corn crib. He told me all of this right there at the bar, and he laughed when he was done, and I stood there and let him finish. Then I set my own glass down and walked out. I don't know exactly what I thought in those first few minutes. I had my horse at the rail and I stood there with my hand on her neck and just let things settle. The sun was going down behind the feed store. There were 2 boys rolling a hoop down the street, laughing at something. Everything looked ordinary. But I kept seeing the chain, a log chain, 3 days. I'm not a man who charges into things. I never have been. I spent 41 years on this earth learning that the men who charge in fast usually end up making the problem worse or getting themselves killed or both. I think slow and I move deliberate, and most of the time that served me fine. But I also know wrong when I hear it laid out plain, and what Deke Ferris described to me was wrong in a way that didn't need thinking about. It just needed doing something about. I rode home, got my rifle and my bedroll, told my hand Ernesto where I was going and when to expect me back. Ernesto looked at me for a moment and then nodded without asking questions, which is one of the things I've always valued in him. I rode out to the Vass place. The Vass quarter section sat about 11 miles southeast of town, back off the Caldwell Road. Clement had never done much with it. The house was small and weather-beaten, the barn in better shape than the house, a few outbuildings scattered around a central yard. I knew the layout from having been there once years back, for some occasion I can't now recall. A birthday dinner maybe, or a branding. It was full dark by the time I rode in. I came in slow from the north off the road through the pasture. There was a light in the house, another in what I took to be the barn. The corn crib was the low structure east of the barn, maybe 30 feet long, slatted wood, a plank door on the near end. I could see the padlock on the door from 20 feet away. I sat on my horse for a moment and listened. Somebody moving around in the barn, one set of footsteps unhurried. No other sound from the yard, except the wind in the corn. I tied my horse to the fence post at the pasture's edge and went to the corn crib on foot. I got close enough to put my hand on the door and said quietly, "Mrs. Vass." Nothing for a moment. Then from inside, in a voice that was careful and controlled, "Who's there?" "Cal Briggs, I knew your husband. I'm going to get this lock off." Another pause. "How?" "I have a rifle." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "The one in the barn will hear." "I know." I don't know what she made of that, but she didn't try to talk me out of it. I stepped back from the door, set myself, and put a round through the shackle of the padlock. It was loud. Everything after that moved fast. The barn door banged open, and a man came out, one of the vast hands, young, holding a lantern, and I had my rifle leveled before he'd taken 3 steps. I said, "Set the lantern down and put your hands up." He looked at me and looked at the rifle and set the lantern down and put his hands up. I kept my eye on him while I pulled the chain off the door and got it open. Nora Vass came out of that corn crib like a person walking out of a place she decided she was never going back to. She was filthy and her wrists were raw where the chain had worn them, and she moved a little stiffly, like someone whose joints had been locked in one position too long. But her head was up and her eyes were clear, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, not gratitude exactly, not yet. More like she was taking a measurement. I said to the hand, "Saddle her a horse, the best one in that barn." He looked at Nora, then back at me. I didn't move the rifle. He went in and saddled the horse. Nora went to the trough by the barn and washed her face and hands. She didn't say anything while she did it. There was a shirt on the fence rail nearby, hers, I assumed, and she pulled it on. She was composed in a way that struck me. Most people, after 3 days in a chain, would either be crying or shaking or raging. She was none of those things. She was just getting ready to move. When the hand brought the horse out, she took the reins, put her foot in the stirrup, and mounted up. I said to the hand, "You tell Royce Vass that if he comes after her, he's got a different kind of problem on his hands than a woman with a letter." The hand nodded. He looked relieved, actually, like he'd been waiting for someone to make this particular decision for him. We rode out. We rode north for about an hour without talking much. I set a pace that wasn't a dead run but wasn't slow either, and she kept up without complaint. The night was clear, and the stars were out thick, and the grass made a sound in the wind like water. At some point she said, "You're Briggs, the man with the place on Elm Creek." "That's right. You don't know me." "I know who you are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Deke Ferris told you." He was laughing about it. She didn't say anything to that, but I heard something change in her breathing, a short, hard exhale, and then nothing. She got herself back under control fast. That was the second time in an hour I'd watched her do that. We got to town well after midnight. I took her to the boarding house on Fitch Street and woke the proprietress, Mrs. Enders, who was a practical woman and who, when she saw the state of Nora's wrists, set her mouth in a line and said, "Come inside." She didn't ask me anything. She just took Nora in and shut the door. I went to the hotel and slept a few hours and then got up and went to see Harlan Creddy, who was the county sheriff and who I'd known for 15 years. Harlan was not a man who did things fast either, which is partly why I'd always respected him. He listened to what I told him without interrupting, and when I was done, he sat behind his desk for a while and looked at the wall. Then he said, "You broke that lock yourself." "I did. With a rifle." "That's right." He looked at me. "Cal, that puts you in a complicated position." "I know it does." He drummed his fingers on the desk once. "She's at Enders's." "Far as I know." He nodded slowly. "I'm going to need to ride out there." "I figured you would." "Royce Vass is going to make noise." "He can make all the noise he wants," I said. "She was chained in a corn crib, Harlan, with a log chain for 3 days." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I know it," and he stood up and got his hat. What followed took about 3 weeks, all told. Harlan rode out to the Vass place and had a conversation with Royce that I wasn't privy to. Whatever was said, Royce did not come to town looking for trouble, which told me something about Harlan's way of having conversations. Nora filed her claim on the deed. It turned out Clement had indeed left the land to her, clear as clear could be, according to the lawyer who came up from Austin, and what Royce had been doing was holding her there in hopes she'd sign it over. The burned letters were part of that. The chain was when burning the letters hadn't been enough. I won't say justice moved fast. It never does, but it moved. I saw Nora a few times during those weeks. She came to my place once to thank me, which I wasn't expecting. I was out back splitting wood when she rode in, and I didn't know she was there until I turned around and found her standing about 10 feet away, watching me. I said, "Mrs. Vass." She said, "Nora." I set them all down. "All right, Nora." She had a basket with her, a jar of preserves and a loaf of bread, which I thought was a kindness far past what the situation called for. She held it out, and I took it and set it on the fence post, and then we stood there for a moment in the way of two people who don't know each other well and have been through something unusual together. She said, "I want you to know I was getting out of that crib one way or another." I said, "I believe you. I want you to know it wasn't helplessness you were rescuing. I had a nail I'd been working on the hinge for 2 days." I looked at her. She was serious. Her eyes were steady and dark, and she was watching me with that measuring quality again, the one I'd first seen in the yard. I said, "That makes me feel better about the whole thing, actually." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. I should say something about what I was before all this, because it matters to understanding what came after. I was a man who had been alone a long time. My wife, Josephine, had died 8 years earlier of a sickness that took her faster than either of us was ready for, which I suppose is how those things go. We'd had 12 years together, no children, just the two of us and the land and the work, and when she was gone there was a quiet in my house that never really filled back up. I didn't look for another woman. I told myself I wasn't the kind of man who needed that anymore, that I was past the age for it, that I had the ranch and Ernesto and the horses, and that was a full enough life. I believed that mostly. But I'll tell you what I noticed about Nora Vass from the first minute I laid eyes on her in that yard. She was not soft. She was not waiting to be saved. She was a woman who'd been chained in a corn crib for 3 days and who had been working a nail out of a hinge the whole time. And when she walked out into the night air, she didn't collapse. She got on a horse. That kind of person, you don't meet that kind of person very often. She went back to her land once the legal matters settled. It was hers, free and clear, and she intended to work it. I helped her some. Not because she asked, she didn't ask easily, I'd already learned that about her, but because there were things that needed doing that a single woman couldn't do alone without it taking twice as long, and I had time, and I was willing. I helped her get the fence line repaired. I helped her find a hand who was reliable. I helped her get the water situation sorted out, which had been a problem the Vass brothers had apparently been ignoring for a year. We worked together those weeks, mostly quiet. We weren't people who filled silence for the sake of it. When we talked about the work, about the land, about what she was planning to plant in the spring. She had ideas about the land that were better than anything Clement had managed in 8 years of owning it, and I told her so. She looked at me when I said that, like she was deciding something. Then she said, "Nobody said that to me in a long time." I didn't ask her what she meant. I thought I knew. There was an evening in late October. I'd come over to help her get the last of the season's work finished before the cold set in. We'd worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and when we came in, she made supper and we ate at the table in the kitchen with the lamp between us. After supper she poured coffee and we sat there, and the night pressed in around the house, and the lamp made the kitchen warm and gold. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." "Why did you do it, that first night?" I thought about that. I'd thought about it before. I said, "Because it was wrong and it needed stopping, and I was the one who knew about it." She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up at me. "Deke Ferris told half the town. You were the only one who did anything." I didn't have an answer to that. It was true and it was troubling, and I'd thought about it some in the weeks since. I said, "I know." She nodded once slowly, like she was confirming something she'd already decided. Then she reached across the table and put her hand on mine. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't soft and it wasn't careful, it was just direct, her hand on mine, warm and sure, the way she did everything. And she looked at me and said, "Thank you, Cal." Not for the corn crib. I understood that. She'd been working the nail out of the hinge herself. She'd made sure I understood that. Not for saving her. For being the kind of man who didn't need 3 days to decide that a woman chained in a corn crib was wrong. For being the one who did something when the rest of them stood at bars with drinks in their hands and laughed. That's what she was thanking me for. I turned my hand over under hers and held it. I said, "You'd have gotten out." She said, "Maybe, but I'm glad you came." We didn't say much more that night. She walked me out to my horse when I left, and the air was cold and sharp, and the sky was full of stars. I got up in the saddle and she stood there in the lamplight from the open door, and I looked at her for a moment and she looked at me. She said, "Same time Thursday." I said, "Same time Thursday." I rode home in the dark and the cold, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Not happiness exactly, not yet. More like possibility. Like a door that had been shut for a long time had been opened just a crack, and the air coming through it was different from the air on my side. Winter came on. I kept riding over. She kept working the land, kept making plans, kept doing the 100 hard daily things that keeping a ranch alive requires. I helped where I could, and she let me, and we figured out the shape of a partnership between us that wasn't spoken out loud but was real nonetheless. In December, there was a week of hard cold that froze the creek and killed 2 of her calves. I came over and found her in the barn in the early morning, working on the 3rd one, trying to get it warm. We worked on it together for 2 hours, taking turns, and saved it. Afterward, we sat on the barn floor with our backs against the wall and our breath making clouds in the cold air, and we were both too tired to talk. She fell asleep against my shoulder. I sat there and didn't move. Outside, the wind pushed at the barn walls. The calf breathed in the straw. The lamp made a low gold circle around us. I had my whole life in that barn. The work, the land, the cold, and a woman who'd chosen to fall asleep against my shoulder, which she would not have done if she hadn't decided something about me that she trusted. That's all I wanted. That's all I'd ever wanted, really, to be a man that a good woman could trust with her weight. She asked me to stay on in January. Not at the ranch. She was careful about her reputation and I respected that. But she asked me to partner with her on the land formally, a working partnership, properly arranged. We went to the same Austin lawyer who'd handled her deed claim and we drew it up right. On the way home from the lawyer's office I said, "This is a big thing." She said, "I know what it is." I said, "I want to be straight with you about what I'm hoping it leads to, because I'm not a man who's good at the indirect way of saying things." She looked at me from her side of the wagon. She was holding her gloves in her lap and her eyes were steady and calm, the way they always were. She said, "Neither am I say what you mean, Cal." So I did. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. The horse's breath made steam in the cold air. The bare trees made patterns against the winter sky. Then she turned and looked at me and said, "I figured that was where this was going." I said, "And?" She said, "And I came to the lawyer with you, didn't I?" I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. She'd known what I was going to say before I said it and she'd come anyway. That was her answer. I picked up the reins and clicked the horses forward, and she settled back on the seat beside me, her shoulder touching mine, and we drove home through the cold. We married in March. Small. Just Harlan and his wife, Ernesto, and Mrs. Enders, who'd taken a proprietary interest in Nora's situation from that first night on Fitch Street. The ceremony was short and the preacher was businesslike about it, which suited us both. Afterward we had supper at the hotel dining room, and Harlan made a toast that was brief and generous, and then we went home. Home was her place mostly, though we kept my land running too. There was more work between us than either of us had managed alone, and we were both the kind of people who didn't mind work. That spring she planted the south field the way she'd been planning since before I knew her. She'd had it in her head even while she was in that corn crib. She told me once what she was going to do with the land when she got it back. She'd been planning it in the dark. I thought about that sometimes. What it said about her, that while Royce Vass had her chained up, she was planning her garden. I'm an old man now, well, older. My back doesn't like cold mornings the way it used to, and there are lines in my face that weren't there when I rode out to the Vass place with a rifle and a bedroll, and not much of a plan. Nora's sitting across the room from me as I tell this. She's reading, the way she does most evenings, with a lamp pulled close and her feet tucked under her on the chair. She's 52 years old and her hair has some silver in it, and she still holds her head the same way she did when she walked out of that corn crib, straight, level, like a woman who's decided what she thinks and isn't in a hurry to be talked out of it. She looked up just now. She can tell when I'm watching her. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She went back to her book. My whole life is in this room, the lamp, the fire doing its work in the stove, the sound of the horses in the barn shifting and settling, the woman across from me who chose me when she could have chosen not to, who trusts me with her weight and her plans and her future, and who was working a nail out of a hinge the whole time she was in that corn crib. Some men spend their whole lives looking for a woman like that. I was lucky enough to be the one who rode out. That's the whole of it.